I woke up drowning in filth. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract sense of degradation or despair, but actually drowning, my mouth and nose filled with thick chemical sludge that tasted of burnt plastic and human waste, and something else I could not identify but which made my throat close with instinct terror. My hands clawed at nothing, found only more liquid darkness, and for several seconds that felt like hours. I truly believed I was dead. And this was what came after, an eternity of choking in toxic blackness while somewhere far away machinery groaned and metal screamed against metal. Then my fingers touched something solid, a pipe or cable or structural support, and I pulled myself up out of the muck with strength born of pure animal panic, breaking the surface of whatever foul pool I had been lying in and gasping air that was only slightly less poisonous than the liquid I had been breathing. The air burned going down my throat, hot and chemical, laced with vapors that made my eyes water and my lungs spasm. But it was air, and I was breathing, and that meant I was still alive, even though I had no memory of how I had gotten here or where here actually was. The darkness around me was not complete, broken by flickering red emergency lumens that cast everything in shades of blood and rust. And in their irregular pulsing, I could see that I was in some kind of chamber or corridor, low-ceilinged and narrow, its walls covered in pipes and conduits and machinery whose purpose I could not begin to guess at. The floor beneath me was not actually a floor, but a grating suspended over what must have been a deeper pit or sump, and through the grating more of that toxic sludge flowed in slow currents that caught the red light and gleamed like infected blood. I tried to stand and immediately fell, my legs refusing to support my weight, muscles weak and trembling as though I had been lying in that filth for days or weeks without moving. My body felt wrong in ways I could not immediately catalogue, bruised and battered and somehow diminished, as though pieces of me had been removed or rearranged while I was unconscious. My head throbbed with a pain that seemed to originate behind my eyes and radiate outward through my skull in waves that made it difficult to think, to remember, to do anything except exist in this moment of suffering and confusion. I lay there on the grating for what might have been minutes or hours, time having lost all meaning in this place of eternal twilight and mechanical groaning. And slowly, piece by piece, memory began to return. My name was Harlan Cross. I was 23 standard years old. I had been born on a hive world called Mordian's Gate in the Segmentum Obscurus. Born in the Underhive where sunlight never reached, and the only law was the law of survival, where gangs controlled the water purifiers, and the Arbites came only when the violence threatened to spill upward into the levels where people who mattered actually lived. I had worked as a runner for one of the smaller gangs, delivering messages and small packages through the maze of tunnels and shanty warrens that made up the lowest levels, a job that paid barely enough to buy nutrient paste and recycled water, but which at least kept me alive and relatively free. I had a sister, younger by 2 years, who worked in one of the corpse starch processing plants, and who dreamed of somehow earning enough throne gelt to buy passage up to the middle hive, where the air was cleaner and the chances of being murdered for your shoes were slightly lower. Then had come the tithe. The Imperium's endless hunger for bodies to feed its wars and its ships and its vast bureaucratic machinery. A hunger that fell upon Mordian's Gate like a plague, sweeping through the hive from top to bottom and taking everyone who could not prove they were more valuable alive and productive than dead and process it. The Arbits had come with armsmen and shock mauls and lists of names and quotas to fill, breaking down doors and dragging people into the streets where administrative officials checked their tattoos and their papers and their genetic markers against some vast database that determined their fate with the cold precision of a sorting machine. Most went to the Imperial Guard, conscripted into regiments that would be shipped off to die on worlds whose names they would never learn, fighting enemies they would never understand. Others went to factory complexes or mining operations or agricultural collectives, their labor extracted until their bodies failed. and they were themselves processed into nutrients or fuel or raw materials. And some, the ones who had committed crimes not quite serious enough to warrant execution, but too serious to overlook. The ones who had failed to pay their tithes, or questioned the wrong officials, or simply been in the wrong place when quotas needed filling. Those unfortunate few were marked for service aboard the Imperial Navy's void ships, pressed into bondage as the lowest form of crew. The bilge workers and maintenance slaves who kept the ancient vessels functioning through endless labor in conditions that made the underhive look comfortable by comparison. I had been one of those unfortunates. My crime had been simple and stupid, the kind of mistake that only seems significant in retrospect. I had been caught carrying a package for my gang that contained contraband data slates, information that someone somewhere had decided was sensitive enough to warrant attention from the Arbites. They had beaten me with shock mauls until I told them who I worked for, then beaten me more when I refused to provide names and locations. And when they tired of beating me, they simply added my name to the tithe lists and moved on to the next unfortunate citizen of the Imperium. I remembered being loaded onto a bulk lifter with hundreds of others, all of us stripped and branded and herded like animals into a cargo hold that stank of sweat and fear and human waste. Remembered the sickening lurch as the lifter broke atmosphere and climbed toward orbit. Remembered seeing through a small porthole the curve of Mordian's gate falling away beneath us, gray and poisoned and the only home I had ever known. I remembered arriving at the orbital docking station, being processed again, given threadbare coveralls that were too large and boots that did not match, being tattooed with a long string of numbers and Gothic script that marked me as property of the Imperial Navy, transferred to a smaller shuttle that ferried us out into the void, toward the massive shape that hung against the stars, like a cathedral made of metal and fury. The Undying Resolve, they called it. A Luna-class cruiser 6 kilometers from prow to stern, ancient beyond comprehension, its hull covered in the scars of centuries of warfare and marked with devotional script and purity seals the size of buildings. I remembered thinking as we approached that it looked less like a ship and more like a city, like an entire hive compressed and welded together and hurled into the darkness between worlds, and I remembered feeling a terror so complete that it made my earlier fear of the Arbites seem like nothing more than childish anxiety. Then we had docked, been herded through airlocks and decontamination chambers and endless corridors that grew progressively more cramped and dark and oppressive, descending through the layers of the ship like souls falling through the circles of some ancient hell, until finally we arrived at the bilge decks, the bottom of the bottom, the place where the unwanted and expendable were kept to service the machinery that kept the Undying Resolve alive and functional. We had been met by an overseer, a scarred brute of a man with augmented limbs and eyes that glowed with sickly green bioluminescence, who had explained in a voice like grinding metal that we were now property of the ship, that we would work until we died, that there was no escape and no mercy, and no hope of anything except survival, measured in hours and days rather than years. He had beaten 2 men to death with his shock maul to demonstrate his authority, their bodies left where they fell as a reminder of how little our lives mattered. And then he had assigned us to our various duties and sent us into the darkness to begin our service to the God Emperor and the Imperium. That had been how long ago, I could not say with any certainty, my sense of time having dissolved into the eternal present of endless work and suffering. Days bled into weeks, bled into months, measured only by the irregular distribution of nutrient paste and the rotation of work assignments that never truly stopped. Sleep taken in brief snatches wherever you could find a space to lie down. Consciousness maintained through sheer stubborn refusal to die, despite the chemical fumes and toxic exposure and constant physical trauma. I pulled myself to my hands and knees, then slowly to my feet, leaning against the wall for support, while my vision swam and my stomach threatened to empty itself of contents I could not remember consuming. My coveralls were soaked through with whatever foul liquid I'd been lying in, the fabric stiff with accumulated filth and chemicals that made my skin itch and burn. Somewhere in the darkness around me, I could hear voices, other workers moving through the corridors on whatever assignments had been given them by the overseers. Their words indistinct, but their tone familiar, that flat, exhausted acceptance that characterized all speech in the bilge. Conversation stripped of anything except bare utility and information exchange. I started walking, choosing a direction at random because all directions in the bilge were equally miserable. Moving through corridors barely wide enough for my shoulders, stepping over or around piles of debris and mechanical components, and occasionally the remains of workers who had died and not yet been collected for processing. The red emergency lumens provided just enough light to avoid walking into walls, but not enough to see more than a few meters ahead, creating the impression of walking through an endless tunnel that shifted and changed with each step. Never quite the same place twice, despite the fundamental sameness of the environment. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing cold in sections near the outer hull where the void's chill leaked through insufficient insulation, scalding hot near plasma conduits or waste reclamation systems, creating a constant state of physical discomfort that became background noise after a while, something to endure rather than actively notice. The sounds were worse than the temperature, a constant symphony of mechanical suffering that never stopped, never varied except in intensity and proximity. Metal groaning under stress loads it was never designed to bear, pipes hissing with escaping steam or gases or liquids whose composition I did not want to consider, distant explosions or impacts that might have been weapons fire, or might have been structural failures, or might have been something else entirely. Occasionally there would be human sounds too, screaming or crying, or the wet organic noises of violence being done in the darkness. But those sounds were rare, and when they occurred, the workers around you simply kept moving, kept working, because to stop and investigate or help was to invite the attention of the overseers, or worse. And in the bilge, the first rule was always to mind your own business and survive another hour. I found my way to what passed for a common area, a slightly wider section of corridor where several pipes converged and created a space large enough for perhaps 20 people to stand without touching, where workers gathered during the brief periods when they were not actively assigned to tasks, where the nutrient paste dispensers were mounted to the walls and occasionally actually functioned. There were perhaps a dozen others there when I arrived, all of them looking as exhausted and filth-covered as I felt, their faces marked by radiation burns and chemical scarring, and the hollow-eyed stare that came from too little sleep and too much exposure to conditions no human was meant to endure. I recognized some of them vaguely, people I had worked beside or seen in passing during my time in the bilge, though names were rarely exchanged, and personal histories were something you learned to keep to yourself unless you wanted to be marked as different or strange or potentially dangerous to know. One of them, an older man with a third arm growing from his shoulder that he kept carefully hidden under his coveralls, glanced at me and then looked away, the universal bilge gesture that meant he had seen me but would not acknowledge my presence unless I spoke first. Another, a woman who might have been anywhere from 20 to 50 years old, her face so scarred and weathered that age was impossible to determine, was scraping something gray and paste-like from a dispenser into a battered metal cup, her movements mechanical and precise, suggesting long practice at extracting the maximum amount of food from equipment that was designed to be as stingy as possible. I approached one of the dispensers and pressed the activation stud, hearing the gurgle and hiss of internal machinery that might or might not actually function, and after several long seconds during which I had time to wonder if I would need to find another dispenser or simply go without food, a thin stream of gray-green paste began to flow from the nozzle into my cupped hands. The paste was lukewarm and had the consistency of construction adhesive, tasting primarily of chemicals and rust, with an underlying organic flavor that might have been nutrients or might have been something far less pleasant that I had trained myself not to think about too carefully. The rumor was that it was corpse starch, that the bodies of dead crew members were processed and recycled into food to avoid wasting valuable organic material. And while I had no way of verifying this rumor, I also had no way of disproving it, and the truth was that after the first few times eating the paste, you stopped caring about its origins and simply consumed it because the alternative was starvation. I ate standing there by the dispenser, licking the paste from my hands and trying not to think about what it was or where it had come from or what it was doing to my internal organs, focusing instead on the simple fact of calories entering my body and providing the energy needed to continue existing for another few hours. When I was finished, I wiped my hands on my coveralls, though this did nothing to actually clean them since the coveralls were already so filthy that adding more filth made no meaningful difference. And then I stood there, trying to remember what I was supposed to be doing, what task I'd been assigned before I had ended up unconscious in a pool of toxic waste. "You look like hell," someone said, and I turned to see the woman with the scarred face looking at me with an expression that might have been concern or might have been simple observation of fact. "Worse than usual, I mean. You get caught in that coolant rupture on deck 97? I tried to remember and could not. My memory of recent events a confused blur of darkness and pain and chemical fumes. "I don't know," I said, my voice coming out rough and broken, my throat still raw from whatever I had been breathing earlier. "Can't remember how I got here." She nodded as though this was perfectly normal, which in the bilge it probably was. "Happens sometimes. Chemical exposure, radiation, lack of oxygen, any number of things can scramble your memory. You'll remember or you won't. Doesn't much matter either way. Overseer Crane was looking for you earlier. Said you were supposed to be clearing a blockage in the waste reclamation system on deck 112. If you're smart, you'll get down there before he comes looking for you again." The mention of Overseer Crane made something cold and sharp twist in my stomach. Crane was one of the worst of the overseers, a former Imperial Guard sergeant who had been transferred to ship service after losing his legs in combat and receiving crude augmented replacements that gave him enhanced strength and allowed him to move through the cramped bilge corridors with disturbing speed. He carried a shock maul that he used with casual brutality on any worker he deemed insufficiently productive or respectful, and more than once I had seen him beat someone unconscious or worse for the crime of being too slow or too tired or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The fact that he had been looking for me was not good news, and the fact that I had apparently missed an assignment was even worse. I thanked the woman, though she had already turned away and was moving toward one of the corridor exits, and then I started making my way toward deck 112, following corridors that twisted and branched in ways that seemed to defy normal geometry, descending through levels that grew progressively hotter and more toxic as I approached the waste reclamation systems. The ship's internal layout made no sense to anyone who had not spent significant time learning its peculiar geography. Corridors that ended in blank walls or sudden drops into darkness, staircases that spiraled down through multiple decks, only to emerge in places that seemed to be at the same level you had started from, maintenance shafts that connected distant parts of the ship in ways that the official deck plans did not acknowledge and probably did not know about. The bilge workers developed their own mental maps through trial and error, learning which routes were passable and which were blocked by debris or structural failure or areas that had been sealed off after some disaster and never reopened. You learned which sections to avoid because they were too hot or too radioactive or infested with mutants who had devolved into feral savagery. And you learned which sections offered relative safety, small alcoves or forgotten chambers where you could rest for a few minutes without being immediately discovered by the overseers. The knowledge was passed down through informal networks, newer workers learning from those who had survived longer, a collective pool of survival information that was more valuable than any official documentation or training. Deck 112 was located in one of the deepest parts of the bilge, near the ship's core, where the plasma drives created temperatures that would have been instantly lethal without the layers of insulation and coolant systems that surrounded them, though even with those protections, the ambient temperature was high enough to make breathing difficult and extended exposure dangerous. The waste reclamation systems processed the ship's organic and chemical waste, breaking it down into components that could be recycled or safely vented. A necessity on a void ship where nothing could be truly discarded, and every molecule of air and water and nutrients had to be preserved and reused across decades or centuries of continuous operation. The systems were ancient and poorly maintained, prone to blockages and failures that required regular manual intervention from bilge workers, who were sent into the pipes and chambers to clear whatever had accumulated or broken down. I found the entrance to the reclamation system access corridor and descended through a narrow shaft that forced me to climb down a ladder whose rungs were slick with condensation and chemical residue, my hands slipping on the metal as I descended into darkness that was broken only by the faint, bioluminescent glow of fungus growing on the walls. The air grew thicker and harder to breathe the farther down I went, heavy with moisture and chemical vapors that made my eyes water and my lungs burn. And by the time I reached the bottom of the shaft, I was coughing hard enough that I had to pause and lean against the wall while my body tried to adapt to the toxic atmosphere. The access corridor was barely large enough to crawl through, forcing me to move on my hands and knees through ankle-deep sludge that was warm and viscous, and smelled of things I did not want to identify. My hands touched things in that sludge, soft organic masses or hard angular objects that moved under my touch, and I learned very quickly not to look at what I was touching, not to think about it, not to let my imagination provide details that my limited visibility was mercifully obscuring. The only light came from my work-issued luminator, a small device that clipped to my coveralls and provided a weak yellow beam that did more to create shadows than illuminate them, making every surface look diseased and corrupt. The blockage I was supposed to clear was located at a junction where 3 pipes converged, each pipe wide enough that I could fit inside if I was willing to contort my body into painful positions, which I was because the alternative was facing Overseer Crane's displeasure. The blockage itself was a mass of solidified organic material mixed with chemical deposits and unidentifiable debris, forming a plug that had prevented proper flow through the system and was apparently causing backup in multiple decks above. I had been provided with crude tools, a long metal rod with a hook on one end, and a small chemical solvent dispenser, and my job was to manually break up the blockage and allow it to flow through to the processing chambers deeper in the system. I spent what felt like hours working in that cramped space, using the rod to break apart chunks of the solidified mass while the chemical solvent dissolved the edges. The work made harder by the fact that I could barely see what I was doing and the vapors from the solvent were strong enough to make me dizzy and nauseous. Pieces of the blockage would occasionally break free and flow past me in the narrow pipe, splashing against my face and body with disturbing warmth, and more than once I had to stop and simply focus on breathing, on not panicking, on not thinking about the fact that I was trapped in a pipe deep in the bowels of a void ship with millions of liters of toxic waste potentially above me that would drown me instantly if something went wrong with the flow controls. The work was mindless and painful and degrading in ways that went beyond the simple physical discomfort, reducing me to a creature whose entire existence consisted of breaking apart filth in darkness, and I found my mind wandering as I worked, thinking about my sister still processing corpses on Mordian's gate, wondering if she even knew what had happened to me, if she thought I was dead or simply gone, if she ever looked up at the stars and wondered where I was. I thought about the life I might have had if I had made different choices, if I had not agreed to carry that package for the gang, if I had found legitimate work or managed to save enough to move up to the middle hive, where opportunities were slightly better and the arbits were slightly less likely to simply press gang you for minor infractions. But those thoughts led nowhere except to despair, because the truth was that in the Imperium there were no real choices for people born in the Underhive, no legitimate paths to anything except different forms of suffering, and whether you died in a gang fight or in a factory accident or in the bilge of a void ship, the result was the same. You were meat, resources to be extracted and utilized until nothing remained worth extracting, and then you were processed and recycled, and your component parts were used to create nutrients or fuel or materials that would support the continued function of the vast machine that was the Imperium. The only variable was how long the process took and how much suffering you experienced before it was complete. I'd nearly finished clearing the blockage when I heard voices echoing through the pipes, harsh and authoritative. My blood went cold because I recognized one of them. Overseer Crane had found me, or rather had come to inspect my work, and from the tone of his voice, he was not pleased. I worked faster, trying to break apart the last sections of the blockage before he arrived, knowing that any delay or failure would result in punishment, but also knowing that rushing increased the chance of making a mistake that would also result in punishment. The voices grew louder, and I could hear multiple sets of boots on metal grating approaching the junction where I was working, and then there was a sharp rap on the pipe near my feet that made me flinch and nearly drop my tools. "Cross!" Crane's voice was distorted by the metal and the echoes, but unmistakable in its anger. "Get out here where I can see you, bilge rat." I backed out of the pipe as quickly as I could manage in the confined space, emerging into the access corridor covered in filth and chemicals, my muscles cramped and aching from hours of contortion. Crane was standing there with two other overseers I did not recognize, his augmented legs giving him extra height that made him loom over me in the narrow space, his shock maul held casually in one hand, but ready to be used at the slightest provocation. His face was a mass of scar tissue and crude augmented features, one eye replaced with a red optical implant that glowed in the darkness like a predator's eye, catching light. "You were supposed to clear this blockage 6 hours ago," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I had to send another team to handle the backup on Deck 98 because you were too busy sleeping in the bilge like a worthless piece of offal. Give me one reason I shouldn't beat you into paste and feed you to the reclamation system yourself." I tried to explain about waking up in the toxic pool, about the memory loss, about doing my best to complete the assignment once I remembered, but the words came out wrong, disjointed and defensive, and I could see in Crane's expression that he did not care about explanations, only about results and compliance, and the exercise of his authority over workers who had no recourse and no protection except their utility to the ship. He raised the shock maul and I braced for the impact, knowing from experience that trying to dodge or defend yourself only made things worse, that the best strategy was to take the beating and hope it was not severe enough to prevent you from working afterward. The shock maul hit my shoulder with a crack of electrical discharge that sent pain searing through my nervous system like fire in my veins, every muscle locking up involuntarily, my body collapsing to the filthy floor while Crane stood over me and delivered 2 more blows to my ribs and back, each one accompanied by that same electrical surge that made coherent thought impossible. When he finally stopped, I lay there gasping and twitching, my body not quite under my control, tasting blood in my mouth where I had bitten my tongue. Crane nudged me with one augmented foot, not gently, checking to see if I was still conscious. "Get back to work," he said, and then he and the other overseers moved on down the corridor, their voices fading into the distance as they discussed other assignments and other failures and other workers who needed correction. I lay there for several more minutes, waiting for the electrical after-effects to fade enough that I could move, my mind blank, except for the immediate reality of pain and the knowledge that this was normal, that this was what life in the bilge meant, that there would be no justice or mercy or hope of improvement, only endless variation on the same fundamental theme of suffering and survival. Eventually, I managed to pull myself back to my feet and return to the blocked pipe, finishing the work that needed to be done because the alternative was worse punishment, my body moving through the motions with mechanical precision while my mind drifted elsewhere, anywhere, seeking escape in fantasy or memory or simple dissociation from the present moment. When the blockage was finally clear and the waste flowing properly through the system, I reported to the nearest Vox station and informed the duty officer that the task was complete, then made my way back up through the levels toward what passed for living quarters in the bilge, moving slowly through corridors that seemed to shift and change with each passage, my sense of direction compromised by pain and exhaustion and the fundamental sameness of the environment. The living quarters were not quarters in any meaningful sense, but rather small crawl spaces between machinery or pipes where workers could lie down for brief periods, claiming whatever space they could find and defending it through informal arrangements with nearby workers. My space was a gap between two massive fuel lines that ran through Deck 94, barely large enough to lie down in with my knees bent, the metal walls radiating heat from the fuel flowing through them, but at least offering some privacy and relative protection from the traffic of the corridors. I had claimed this space weeks or months ago. I could not remember exactly, and had established it as mine through the simple expedient of being present and defending it when necessary, which mostly meant being willing to fight other workers who tried to claim it when I was absent. I crawled into the space and lay there in the darkness, my body still aching from the shock maw beating, my mind too exhausted to process anything except the immediate sensory information of heat and darkness and the constant thrum of machinery. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and troubled, filled with dreams of drowning and falling and being crushed by mechanical forces beyond my comprehension, my unconscious mind processing the trauma of the day in ways that offered no rest or recovery. I woke several times to the sound of alarms or explosions or simply the groaning of the ship's structure, each time unsure if I was actually awake or still dreaming, the boundary between conscious and unconscious experience blurred by the surreal horror of my environment. Time passed, measured not in hours or days, but in assignments and beatings and meals of gray paste consumed standing by malfunctioning dispensers. I learned to move through the bilge with greater efficiency, mapping the corridors and shafts in my mind, learning which overseers to avoid and which workers could be trusted to share information or help in emergency. I learned that the ship had been built millennia ago, that much of its machinery was only partially understood even by the tech priests who performed the maintenance rituals, that the Gothic script and purity seals covering every surface were not merely decorative but part of the sacred covenant between humanity and the machine spirits that animated the vessel. I learned that fires were the greatest fear in the bilge, that a single spark in the wrong location could spread through oxygen-rich compartments faster than workers could evacuate, that bulkheads would seal automatically to contain the flames, even if it meant trapping dozens or hundreds of people inside to burn. I learned that the mutant population living in the deepest parts of the bilge was larger than anyone admitted, that radiation and chemical exposure and warp transit effects created deformities and genetic damage that accumulated over generations, that some of these mutants had devolved into barely human creatures called Hulgasts, that hunted through abandoned sections and occasionally took workers who strayed too far from the populated corridors. I learned all of this through experience and observation, and the informal education that passed between workers who had survived long enough to accumulate knowledge worth sharing. There was a woman named Yara who had been born on the ship, her entire life spent in the bilge, who claimed she had never seen sunlight or breathed air that had not been recycled 1,000 times, who spoke of the upper decks as though they were mythical places inhabited by beings so far removed from bilge workers that they might as well be different species. There was a man named Dren, who had once worked on the gun decks, who told stories of void combat and boarding actions, and the terrible beauty of lance batteries firing in perfect synchronized sequence, who had been demoted to the bilge after some infraction he would not discuss, and who still maintained the discipline and bearing of a proper naval rating, even though he now spent his days crawling through waste pipes and machinery shafts. There was the man with the third arm, whose name I never learned, who had developed his mutation through radiation exposure and who lived in constant fear of being taken by the twist catchers, the brutal enforcers who managed the mutant population and pressed them into service for the most dangerous work when regular workers were deemed too valuable to waste. He kept his extra limb hidden under specially modified coveralls and moved through the bilge with paranoid vigilance, never staying in one place long, always ready to flee or fight if someone reported him to the authorities. I never learned what happened to him, but one day he simply was not there anymore. His space in the common area abandoned, and nobody spoke of him or asked questions, because in the bilge, the first rule was always to mind your own business and survive another day. The food remained consistently terrible. The gray-green paste dispensed from corroded machines that sometimes worked and sometimes did not, leaving hundreds without food for days until repairs were made or replacement equipment was installed. On days when the dispensers failed, we would supplement our diet with whatever we could find or catch in the darkness, mutant rats that grew fat on leaked nutrients and organic waste, fungi that colonized the warm, damp surfaces near steam vents, occasionally packages of expired emergency rations that had been stored in forgotten compartments and were technically the property of the ship, but which workers would steal when opportunity arose and necessity demanded. The water was even worse than the food, drawn from recycling systems that processed the ship's waste through mechanical and chemical filters that removed most but not all of the contaminants, leaving a liquid that was technically potable but which tasted of rust and chemicals and something organic that made you wonder what had been in the water before it was filtered. It came from taps and dispensers scattered throughout the bilge, marked with purity seals and benedictions to the machine god that were supposed to ensure its safety, but which everyone knew were more ritual than reality. You drank it because the alternative was dehydration and death, and you tried not to think about the fact that everything you were drinking had been through other bodies, other systems, other uses, before being recycled into its current form. The worst part was not the physical conditions, though those were terrible enough, but rather the psychological toll of existing in an environment that never changed, never improved, never offered any variation except in the particular form of suffering you experienced on any given day. There was no day or night cycle in the bilge, only the constant red emergency lumens and the eternal darkness beyond their reach. No seasons or weather or any of the natural rhythms that human psychology had evolved to expect. Time became meaningless, a continuous present moment that stretched backward and forward into infinity, weeks blending into months, blending into years with no markers or milestones to distinguish one period from another. Some workers went mad, their minds breaking under the strain of endless sameness and suffering. I saw a woman spend 3 hours having a conversation with a section of bulkhead, speaking to it as though it were her mother, responding to replies that only she could hear, her voice calm and reasonable even as she discussed topics that made no sense and answered questions that had not been asked. I saw a man walk deliberately into a plasma conduit, his body vaporizing instantly in a flash of superheated gas. His final act, one of choice, in an environment that offered almost no choices at all. I saw others simply stop functioning, going through the motions of work and eating and sleeping, but with no awareness behind their eyes, their consciousness having retreated to some interior space where the external reality could not reach them. I felt my own mind beginning to fray at the edges, my thoughts becoming less coherent, my memory of my life before the ship growing hazy and uncertain, as though the person I'd been on Mordian's Gate was someone I had heard about, rather than someone I had actually been. My sister's face became harder to recall with each attempt, her features blurring and shifting in my memory, until I was no longer certain what she actually looked like, whether her hair had been long or short, whether her eyes had been green or brown, whether she had the scar on her cheek from the factory accident, or if I was confusing her with someone else. The loss of these memories felt like a kind of death, A dissolution of identity that was in some ways worse than physical death, because it meant that even if my body survived the bilge, myself would not, that eventually I would become just another mindless thing that moved through the darkness performing tasks without understanding or caring why. Then came the day when something happened that shattered the routine of bilge existence and showed me that the horror I had been experiencing was not the limit of what the ship could inflict, that there were gradations of suffering that extended far beyond what I had yet encountered. It began with an alarm, not the standard klaxons that signaled minor emergencies or shift changes, but rather a deep howling siren that I had never heard before, a sound that seemed to come from the very structure of the ship itself, vibrating through the metal and making my bones ache with its resonance. Workers around me stopped what they were doing and looked toward the source of the sound, their faces showing not fear exactly, but rather a resigned certainty that whatever was happening would be bad and would likely result in deaths that would be neither mourned nor recorded. The Vox stations throughout the bilge crackled to life, a tech priest's mechanical voice announcing that all workers were to report to emergency muster points for assignment to damage control parties. That this was not a drill, that failure to comply would result in immediate termination. The wording was vague enough that it could have meant anything from a simple mechanical failure to a full hull breach, from a small fire to a catastrophic system failure that threatened the entire ship. Workers began moving toward the designated muster points with the shuffling urgency of people who knew that speed was required, but who also knew that panic was dangerous in the cramped confines of the bilge, who had learned through experience that the fastest workers were not always the ones who survived. I made my way to the nearest muster point, a wider section of corridor where an overseer I did not recognize was organizing workers into teams and assigning them to different sections of the ship. The overseer was shouting orders and consulting a data slate that displayed information about the emergency, his augmented voice cutting through the noise of alarms and running feet and distant impacts that suggested something was indeed very wrong with the ship. When my turn came, he looked at me with mechanical eyes that showed no recognition or interest, checked some detail on his slate, and then pointed me toward a group of workers who were being issued crude fire suppression equipment, foam canisters and water hoses, and protective gear that looked like it had been salvaged from some previous emergency and never properly maintained. "Plasma conduit rupture on deck 49, the overseer said, his voice devoid of emotion or concern. "Fire spreading through ventilation systems. Your team will advance to bulkhead 7 Alpha and establish a suppression line. If the fire breaks through the bulkhead, you will fall back to bulkhead 7 Beta and establish a new line. If the fire breaks through 7 Beta, you will be sealed in and your sacrifice will be noted in the ship's logs. Ave Imperator." The casual mention of being sealed in and left to burn was delivered with the same tone one might use to discuss the weather, and none of the workers reacted with anything except that same resigned acceptance that characterized all response to authority in the bilge. We collected our equipment and began moving toward deck 49, climbing up through levels that grew progressively hotter and more smoke-filled, the air becoming thick and acrid, making breathing difficult even before we reached the actual fire zone. Other teams of workers were moving through the corridors in different directions, some advancing toward other fire zones, others carrying the wounded or dead away from sections that had already been overwhelmed. The ship's internal structure revealed as a warren of interconnected disasters requiring constant management and sacrifice to contain. We reached bulkhead 7 Alpha to find it already under siege from the fire beyond, the metal glowing red-hot in sections, smoke pouring through gaps in the seal where the ancient metal had warped or corroded. The temperature in the corridor high enough that I could feel my skin beginning to blister even through my protective gear. The Infernus Master coordinating the response was a massive man in articulated armor that made him look like some mechanical demon. his voice amplified by external speakers as he directed teams to different positions, orchestrating a defense that seemed less about stopping the fire and more about channeling it away from critical systems and accepting its consumption of everything else. "Foam teams to the forward position," he bellowed, and our team moved forward to where the heat was most intense, where the bulkhead was actually beginning to buckle inward from the pressure and temperature beyond. We activated our foam canisters and began spraying the chemical mixture at the hotspots, watching it expand and harden on contact with the superheated metal, providing temporary insulation that bought seconds or minutes rather than any real solution to the underlying problem. The foam smelled terrible, some combination of chemicals and burning polymers that added to the existing smoke and made the air even more toxic than it had been. And I could feel my lungs burning with each breath, feel my vision beginning to blur from heat and chemical exposure. Workers around me were collapsing, their bodies simply giving out under the extreme conditions, falling where they stood and being dragged away by other workers, who would themselves likely collapse in turn, the supply of fresh bodies apparently considered more renewable than the ancient equipment we were trying to protect. I saw one man's protective gear catch fire, the cheap materials igniting in the heat, watched him run screaming down the corridor before other workers tackled him and beat out the flames with their bare hands, leaving him a smoking ruin of burned flesh that was probably dead, but which continued to make sounds for several seconds before finally going silent. I saw another worker crushed when a section of the ceiling collapsed, the superheated metal simply losing structural integrity and falling in a shower of sparks and debris that killed 2 others and wounded several more. Their bodies left where they fell because there was no time to move them and nowhere to move them to. The fire fought back against our efforts with the mindless persistence of a natural force that cared nothing for human suffering or sacrifice, advancing through ventilation ducts and cable runs and structural spaces that we could not reach or protect, finding new paths around our defensive lines, always threatening to break through into areas where its spread would become unstoppable. We fell back from 7 Alpha to 7 Beta as the first bulkhead finally gave way, the metal simply melting through in several locations and allowing a wave of superheated air and flame to wash through the corridor, consuming everything in its path and forcing our retreat through corridors that were already being sealed by automatic systems designed to contain the damage, even at the cost of trapping workers inside. At 7 Beta, we established a new defensive line, though by this point, most of the original team was gone, replaced by fresh workers who had been pulled from other duties and thrown into the breach with the same casual disregard for their survival that characterized all bilge management. I was still there, still fighting the fire with equipment that was running out of foam and water, still breathing air that was more smoke and chemicals than oxygen, still conscious through sheer stubborn refusal to die, even though part of me recognized that death might be preferable to the ongoing torture of my existence. My hands were burned, my lungs were damaged, my body was operating on reserves that were nearly depleted, and yet I continued to spray foam and water at spots where the fire threatened to break through because the alternative was to stop and sit down and wait for the end. The Infernus Master's voice continued to boom through the smoke and chaos, directing resources and personnel with the cold efficiency of someone playing a strategic game where the pieces were human lives and the objective was something abstract and distant and worth any sacrifice to achieve. I learned later that the fire had started when a plasma conduit that had not been properly maintained for centuries finally failed under normal operating stress, that the rupture had occurred in a section of the ship where multiple critical systems converged, that if the fire had been allowed to spread into those systems, the entire ship might have been lost, that the sacrifice of dozens or hundreds of bilge workers was considered not just acceptable but cheap compared to the value of the ship itself and the thousands of more important people aboard who depended on its continued function. After what might have been hours or might have been days, the fire was finally contained, not defeated, but rather channeled and isolated until it burned itself out for lack of fuel in sections that had been deliberately sacrificed to save everything else. The bulkheads had held at 7 beta, though just barely, and teams of tech priests were already moving into the burned areas to assess the damage and begin the long process of repair and ritual purification. Bodies were removed from the corridors, some burned beyond recognition, others suffocated by smoke, others crushed by falling debris, all of them loaded onto cargo sledges and taken away for processing into nutrients or fuel or whatever useful materials could be extracted from their remains. I survived, though I was not sure whether this represented luck or simply a failure of the fire to finish what it had started. My body was damaged in ways that would never fully heal, my lungs scarred from smoke inhalation. My hands burned badly enough that gripping tools would always be painful, my hearing damaged by the constant noise of alarms and explosions and mechanical screaming. But I was alive and mobile, and therefore still useful, still capable of labor, still an asset that could be extracted rather than a liability that needed processing. And so I was sent back to my duties with no recognition or reward for my sacrifice, except the knowledge that I had helped save the ship and in doing so had validated my continued existence for another day or week or month. The fire had shown me something important about the nature of my situation, had revealed the fundamental truth that I and all the other bilge workers were not really people in any meaningful sense, but rather consumable resources, spare parts that could be used and discarded as the ship's needs dictated. The officers and crew on the upper decks might have names and histories and some measure of individual identity, but down in the bilge we were interchangeable, distinguished from each other only by the particular skills or assignments we had been given, our lives measured not in years or experiences, but in work shifts and completed tasks, and the amount of suffering we could endure before becoming more useful as processed materials than as functioning workers. This revelation should have been crushing, should have destroyed whatever remained of my will to survive, should have made me give up and accept death as the only escape from an existence that held no hope and no possibility of improvement. Instead, it did something else, created a kind of bitter acceptance that was not quite peace, but which was at least a stable state of being. A recognition that if my life was going to consist of suffering, then at least I could choose how I responded to that suffering, could maintain some small core of self-awareness and defiant consciousness, even as the ship and the Imperium and the endless machinery of exploitation tried to grind me down into nothing more than meat and bone and chemical components to be recycled. I became harder after the fire, more efficient in my movements, more careful about conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risks, more willing to lie or steal or hurt others if it meant better chances of survival. I learned which workers could be trusted and which were informants for the overseers, learned how to find extra food or better sleeping spots, learned how to move through the bilge with minimal exposure to radiation or chemical hazards, learned all the small skills and tricks that separated those who survived months or years from those who died in weeks. I was becoming what the bilge made of everyone who lived there long enough, a creature adapted to its environment, stripped of everything unnecessary for survival, focused entirely on the narrow goal of continuing to exist in a place designed to consume and destroy human life. Then came another change, another revelation that this time truly did shake the foundations of my understanding. It happened during an emergency repair mission that required workers from the bilge to travel up to Deck 47, far above our usual operating area, but still well below the levels where proper crew members lived and worked. The ship had been damaged during warp transit, something about the Geller field failing briefly and allowing warp entities to manifest in certain sections, causing damage that required all hands' response to repair before the next transit window. The details were vague and probably not meant for bilge workers to know, but the result was that dozens of us were herded up through levels we had never seen before, climbing stairs and ladders and moving through corridors that became progressively cleaner and better lit as we ascended. Deck 47 was a shock to my system, a revelation that completely changed my understanding of the ship and my place within it. The corridors there were wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The lighting was actual white illumination rather than red. Emergency lumens. The air was breathable without immediate chemical burns. The temperature was regulated to something approximating comfort rather than randomly fluctuating between freezing and scalding. There were signs posted on the walls giving directions to different sections, actual organized navigation rather than the random maze of the bilge. There were Vox stations that appeared to function properly, water dispensers that produced clear liquid rather than brown chemical slurry, even viewing ports that showed the void beyond the ship's hull, stars scattered across darkness like diamonds on black velvet. More shocking than the physical environment was the people. We encountered gun ratings and armsmen and junior officers moving through the corridors with purpose and organization, wearing clean uniforms rather than filth-caked coveralls, speaking to each other in normal conversational tones rather than the flat, exhausted monotones of the bilge. They looked at us with expressions ranging from pity to disgust to simple indifference, seeing us as something less than human, as creatures from the depths that had temporarily been allowed into their world, but who clearly did not belong there. I watched a junior officer step carefully around our work party, holding her nose against the smell we brought with us, treating us like we were contaminated or diseased or simply too unpleasant to acknowledge beyond the minimum necessary to avoid physical contact. I had known intellectually that the ship was stratified, that there were better conditions on the upper decks, but knowing it and experiencing it were completely different things. To actually see that there were people living on this same vessel who had clean air and edible food and sleeping quarters and some measure of dignity and comfort while we suffocated and starved and died in the bilge was a revelation that made my earlier acceptance seem hollow and insufficient. The suffering of the bilge was not necessary, not inevitable, not the only possible way to organize labor on a void ship. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to concentrate the worst conditions and the hardest labor on a disposable class of workers, while preserving better conditions for those deemed more valuable or important. The rage I felt in that moment was pure and hot and consuming, more intense than any emotion I had experienced since being press-ganged from Mordian's gate. A fury at the fundamental injustice of an existence where some people were granted basic dignity and humanity, while others were deliberately kept in conditions of degradation and suffering. But the rage was also useless, because there was no one to direct it toward, no system to fight against, no possibility of change or improvement through anything I could do. The structure was too vast, too deeply embedded in the fundamental architecture of the Imperium, too thoroughly defended by violence and ideology, and the sheer inertia of millennia of accumulated practice. We completed our repair assignment on Deck 47, working under the supervision of a tech priest who treated us like particularly stupid servitors, pointing at things that needed fixing, and then watching with barely concealed impatience while we attempted to repair them with tools we barely understood and skills we had learned through trial and error rather than proper training. When we were finished, we were herded back down to the bilge, descending through those same levels, watching the light fade and the air grow toxic and the corridors narrow until we were back in our proper place at the bottom of the ship's hierarchy. Back in the darkness and filth and suffering that was apparently our designated role in the vast machinery of Imperial service. I tried to forget what I had seen, tried to push the memory of Deck 47 out of my mind, and return to the state of acceptance I had achieved after the fire, but it was impossible. Once you know that better exists, once you have seen with your own eyes that the suffering is not universal or necessary, but rather targeted and deliberate, you cannot unknow it, cannot unsee it. cannot return to the comfortable fiction that this is simply the way things are and must always be. The other workers who had been on the repair mission were similarly affected, their faces showing something that had not been there before, an awareness that was dangerous and corrosive, and which the overseers would probably punish if they could identify it clearly enough to target. Whispers began to spread through the bilge in the days and weeks following that mission, quiet conversations in the rare moments when workers gathered in relative safety, discussions about whether things could be different, whether conditions could be improved, whether it would be possible to petition the ship's officers for better treatment or at least basic safety improvements. The conversations were cautious and coded, everyone aware that overseers had informants among the workers, that speaking openly about discontent or organizing any kind of collective action was grounds for immediate execution as sedition, that the thin edge of survival we all existed on could be removed at any moment if we pushed too hard against the boundaries of acceptable behavior. But the conversations happened anyway, because once the possibility of something better had been introduced, it was impossible to ignore, impossible to simply accept the current conditions without at least discussing whether they were truly unchangeable. Someone suggested creating a written petition, a formal document that could be presented during the next inspection tour when officers from the upper decks would be moving through the bilge to verify that minimum operating standards were being maintained. Someone else suggested organizing a work slowdown, deliberately reducing our efficiency until conditions improved, though this suggestion was quickly dismissed as suicidal given how expendable we all were and how easily we could be replaced with fresh press-ganged workers from the next world the ship visited. I found myself drawn into these conversations despite knowing how dangerous they were, my anger at the injustice I had witnessed on Deck 47 overcoming my better judgment and my survival instincts. I contributed ideas about what specific improvements we should request, focusing on things that seemed reasonable and achievable: better food quality and quantity, functional water dispensers, basic medical care for injuries and illnesses, reduction in the frequency of beatings from the overseers, more regular sleep periods rather than the current system of endless work interrupted by brief periods of unconsciousness whenever your body could no longer continue. These requests seemed minimal, barely scratching the surface of what would be needed to make the bilge truly livable, but they were at least concrete and specific, the kind of things that could theoretically be granted without fundamentally changing the power structure or resource allocation of the ship. The petition was written by a worker named Jarek, who had some education from his life before the ship. His handwriting crude but legible, the language formal and respectful, framed in terms of improving efficiency and reducing unnecessary worker attrition rather than making any moral claims about rights or dignity that might be seen as seditious. The document included specific complaints documented over months of observation, incidents where workers had died from easily preventable causes, equipment failures that could have been avoided with basic maintenance, situations where better communication or organization could have reduced casualties during emergencies. It was not revolutionary or even particularly bold, just a careful enumeration of problems and proposed solutions written in the language of utility and pragmatic management rather than justice or humanity. The plan was to present this petition during the next scheduled inspection, which happened irregularly, but which someone claimed was due within the next few weeks based on patterns observed over years of service. Workers who supported the petition were instructed to be present at the inspection route if possible, to serve as witnesses, and to demonstrate through their numbers that this was a broad concern rather than the complaint of a few malcontents. The whole scheme was fragile and desperate and probably doomed to failure, but it represented something important, an assertion that we were still human enough to have desires beyond simple survival. Still conscious enough to recognize injustice and name it as such, still capable of collective action even in an environment designed to prevent exactly that kind of solidarity. Then someone betrayed us. I never learned who or why, whether they were an actual informant working for the overseers, or simply someone who believed that any attempt to change the system was dangerous and should be prevented, whether they were motivated by fear or self-interest or genuine belief that the established order was correct and should not be questioned. What I knew was that the overseers learned about the petition and the planned presentation before the inspection could happen, and they moved with swift brutality to eliminate what they saw as a nascent rebellion before it could spread or solidify into something genuinely dangerous. Workers were rounded up in the middle of a sleep period, armsmen descending into the bilge in force and grabbing anyone whose name appeared on a list that had apparently been compiled from informant reports. Jarek was taken, along with a dozen others who had been most vocal in the planning discussions, dragged from their sleeping spaces and beaten with shock mauls before being hauled away to whatever punishment had been decided for them. I was not on the initial list, had apparently been either lucky or careful enough to avoid being specifically identified as a ringleader. But I knew it was only a matter of time before my involvement was discovered, knew that I needed to hide or flee or find some way to avoid being associated with what was now being described over the Vox stations as a seditious conspiracy against the ship's rightful authority. I went deep into the bilge, into sections that were officially sealed or abandoned, places where the radiation levels were high enough that extended exposure meant death, but where short visits were theoretically survivable, where the mutant populations were densest and the overseers rarely ventured unless absolutely necessary. I moved through darkness absolute and complete, my luminator providing the only light, navigating by memory and intuition through corridors that twisted in impossible directions, descending through levels where the air was so toxic that each breath felt like drinking acid, where the temperature was high enough that my skin blistered and my vision swam from heat stroke and chemical exposure. I found a chamber deep in the ship's core, surrounded by warnings written in high Gothic script that I could not read, but whose meaning was clear from the symbols and skull motifs that accompanied them. Inside the chamber were things I had not expected to find. Evidence of previous roundups and purges, bodies that had been dumped here rather than properly processed, some still bearing the marks of torture or execution, others showing signs of starvation or exposure that suggested they had been locked in this space and simply forgotten. The sight should have horrified me, but instead produced only a numb recognition that this was standard practice, that workers who became problematic or inconvenient were not always recycled into nutrients, but sometimes simply disposed of in whatever way was most expedient, their existence erased from the ship's records as though they had never been. I hid in that chamber for what might have been days, surviving on nothing, drinking condensation from pipes that ran through the space, my body slowly failing from radiation exposure and lack of food and the accumulated trauma of months of bilge service. I knew I could not hide forever, knew that eventually I would need to emerge or die in this forgotten place, knew that my only real choice was between surrender and slow death, neither of which offered any meaningful escape from the trap my life had become. The anger I had felt on Deck 47 had evolved into something colder and more final, a recognition that resistance was not noble or heroic, but simply pointless, that the system was too large and too thoroughly defended to be changed by anything I could do, that my only real power was the power to choose how I died rather than how I lived. Eventually, hunger and thirst overcame fear, and I emerged from the chamber, moving back through the abandoned sections toward the populated areas of the bilge, knowing I would likely be caught, but no longer caring enough to expend much effort on avoiding capture. I was found by an overseer patrol within hours, was beaten for my attempted flight, was dragged before a tribunal consisting of the ship's master, or more likely his delegate, since I found it hard to believe that anyone of such high rank would personally concern themselves with a bilge worker's discipline. The man who sat in judgment was a junior officer, whose uniform was clean and whose face showed the kind of casual cruelty that comes from having absolute power over people who cannot fight back, who looked at me the way one might look at a broken tool that had temporarily inconvenienced you by requiring disposal. He gave me a choice, which was itself a form of cruelty, because the choice was between execution and return to service, with my status permanently marked as troublemaker, which would mean worse assignments and closer supervision, and basically an extended death sentence rather than a quick one. I chose return to service, not because I wanted to live, but because some deep, stubborn part of me refused to give them the satisfaction of an easy disposal. Refused to make it simple for them, insisted on extracting whatever cost I could in terms of their time and resources, even if that cost was negligible in the larger scheme of things. The officer seemed mildly annoyed by my choice, as though he had expected or hoped I would choose execution and was now faced with paperwork and continued management of a problem he had wanted to solve cleanly. I was marked, branded actually, a hot iron pressed into my shoulder that left a scar in the shape of some symbol I did not recognize, but which all the overseers apparently understood, because after that I was assigned the worst possible duties, sent into the most toxic sections, given the most dangerous repairs, worked harder and longer than other bilge rats, with even less food and rest, as a form of ongoing punishment that was meant to either break me completely or kill me slowly. I accepted this with the same numb resignation that had characterized my entire existence in the bilge, working through each assignment with mechanical precision, surviving when others died, continuing because stopping would mean acknowledgement that they had won, that they had succeeded in crushing whatever remained of my humanity. The others from the petition attempt disappeared, whether executed or simply scattered to different parts of the ship, I never learned. Jarek I saw once more, weeks or months later, so chained that I almost did not recognize him, his eyes vacant and his movements mechanical, his mind apparently broken by whatever had been done to him during interrogation or punishment. He did not recognize me when I spoke to him, did not respond to his name, simply continued performing whatever task he had been assigned with the mindless precision of a servitor. And I realized that there were fates worse than death, that the ship had ways of destroying people that left their bodies intact and functional while erasing everything that made them human. Years passed, or what felt like years, my sense of time having become completely untethered from any objective reality, measured only in the accumulation of scars and the gradual degradation of my body and the slow erosion of whatever memories I still retained of my life before the ship. I watched new workers arrive, press-ganged from whatever world the ship had visited most recently, their faces showing the same terror and disbelief I'd felt when I first arrived, their bodies not yet adapted to the toxic environment and the endless labor and the casual brutality that characterized every interaction in the bilge. I watched them die or adapt or go mad, the same cycle repeating with each new batch of unfortunates, the ship consuming them and processing them and extracting whatever utility they possessed before discarding their remains. I became one of the veterans, one of the workers who had survived long enough to accumulate knowledge and skills that made them slightly less expendable, who could be consulted about the layout of obscure sections or the peculiar behaviors of ancient machinery, who served as informal guides for newer workers who wanted to survive longer than a few weeks. I did not seek this role, but it came to me anyway, a function of simple longevity and the fact that most workers who survived as long as I had either went mad or became so broken that they could no longer communicate effectively. I found myself showing new workers how to identify safe water sources, which overseers were most dangerous, which sections to avoid during certain parts of the ship's duty cycle. All the accumulated wisdom of survival in hell passed down through informal networks, because no official training or support existed for the lowest class of the ship's hierarchy. I met workers who had been born on the ship, who had never known anything except the bilge, whose entire existence consisted of the darkness and the machinery and the endless labor, without any reference point for what life could be outside this floating prison. They spoke of the upper decks as mythological places, imagined spaces that might or might not exist, their understanding of the ship's structure limited to the few levels they had personal experience with, unable to conceive of the vastness of the vessel or the thousands of other people living in conditions so different from their own that they might as well be different species. I tried to tell them about Deck 47, about the clean air and functioning equipment and the people who lived there, but they looked at me with skepticism and or pity, as though I was describing a fever dream or had gone mad from chemical exposure. The machine spirits that animated the ship became more real to me than any gods or emperors or abstract concepts of duty and service. I could feel the vessel around me, groaning and shuddering with the strain of its existence, ancient metal pushed beyond its design limits, machinery operating on the edge of failure, systems held together by ritual and prayer, and the endless labor of workers who understood nothing except that the alternatives to service were death or worse. I developed an almost religious awareness of the ship's moods and patterns, could sense when warp transit was approaching by subtle changes in the ambient energy, could predict equipment failures by changes in the sounds or vibrations or smells of the environment, could navigate through absolute darkness using only my sense of the ship's structure and the way air moved through its corridors. This awareness did not make my existence better or easier, did not protect me from danger or reduce my suffering, but it did provide a strange kind of companionship, a sense that I was not entirely alone in the darkness, that the ship itself was in some way conscious, and that my labor was part of a vast ongoing process that transcended my individual experience, even as it ground me down into components that would eventually be recycled into its structure. The thought was not comforting, but it was at least meaningful, provided some framework for understanding why I continued to exist and labor and suffer, rather than simply giving up and accepting death as the easier option. I'm still here, still working, still surviving, still maintaining whatever shred of consciousness and self-awareness I can preserve in an environment designed to strip away everything except basic functionality. New workers continue to arrive, continue to die or adapt or go mad, continue to feed the ship's endless hunger for bodies and labor and sacrifice. The overseers continue to beat and kill and manage us with casual brutality. The machinery continues to groan and fail and require constant intervention to prevent catastrophic breakdown. The paste continues to taste of chemicals and death. The water continues to be barely potable. The air continues to burn our lungs and scar our tissue and slowly poison us from the inside out. This is life in the bilge of an Imperial Navy Voidship. This is what service to the God Emperor and the Imperium means for those of us born or pressed into the lowest class of humanity, those of us deemed useful primarily for our capacity to suffer and labor and die in darkness while others live in light. There is no escape, no hope of improvement, no possibility of anything except continuation or cessation. Survival measured in hours and days, rather than years or decades. Existence reduced to its most basic and brutal elements. The ship is eternal, its hunger endless, its need for sacrifice absolute. We are temporary, disposable, meaningful only in aggregate, as the sum total of labor extracted before our bodies fail, and we are processed into nutrients or fuel or raw materials that will be used to maintain the vessel that destroyed us. I am Harlan Cross, and I work in the bilge of the undying resolve, and this is my life, and it will continue until it does not, and when it ends, I will be forgotten instantly and completely. Because in the vast machinery of the Imperium, individual lives have no value except as components in calculations too large and complex for any human mind to comprehend. I accept this because I have no choice, because acceptance is the only alternative to madness or death, because in the end we are all just meat and labor and suffering that fuels an empire built on the bones of trillions who died before us, and will be built on the bones of trillions who will die after us, forever and always. in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and service and the slow, grinding consumption of everything human in service to abstractions that care nothing for our suffering or our sacrifice. This is the horrible life of a Voidship Underdecker. This is what it means to serve. This is what the Imperium requires. This is all there is, and all there ever will be, until the moment when consciousness finally fails and the grinding machinery of extraction and exploitation moves on to the next unfortunate body that can be pressed into service in the eternal darkness between the stars.